The first consul, who was fully aware of the ambitious project pursued by Toussaint, and who could not believe in the least sincerity on his side, would have preferred his removal at the very beginning from the island. He would have preferred to receive him in France as an exile rather than as a captive. But he could in no case allow him his liberty when once his treachery had been unmasked. The unhealthiness of the climate of Saint Domingo and the fatigues and vexations which beset General Leclerc had rapidly led him to his grave. He was replaced in the chief command by General Rochambeau, who brought about the definite loss of the island by his severity, just as his predecessor had weakened its loyalty by too much indulgence. It was in accordance with the wishes of the first consul that his sister had accompanied her husband to San Domingo together with her son. When he heard of her arrival at Toulon, he immediately sent off his aide-de-camp Lauriston to bring the widow and her child back to Paris. One of the principal grievances alleged against us by the English ministry was the mission of Colonel Sebastiani in Egypt. The splendor with which the French envoy had surrounded his mission, the assurance given to the sheiks and to the chiefs of the Mamelukes that General Bonaparte, as head of the French government, had not forgotten them, and that his protection should not be wanting, and the marks of interest lavished in his name excited the suspicions of England. In his report to the first consul, Colonel Sebastiani accused the London cabinet, and with reason, of working in an underhand way to turn away the chiefs of the country from their fidelity to the Porte. But he omitted to mention the friendly reception accorded to him by the English commander. Napoleon, irritated at the want of good faith shown by the British cabinet in the relations which, since the signing of the Peace of Amiens, had been established between the two powers, published the report of Colonel Sebastiani, although this had been intended as a strictly confidential document. At the same time, just before it was printed in the Moniteur, the idea came to him to show it to Monsieur Amédée Joubert, who had accompanied the colonel on his voyage and who was perfectly acquainted with Oriental countries. Monsieur Joubert was called in the night to the house of Monsieur Maret, Secretary of State, and showed him a proof of the report. Joubert advised the minister to suppress several passages, which in his opinion could not fail to produce a regrettable impression and provoke great irritation. But as this report had to appear in the Moniteur of the following morning, these modifications could not be submitted to Napoleon's approval. Monsieur Maret declined to assume the responsibility of these ratifications or postponing the publication of the document. The report accordingly appeared in the Moniteur with some slight modifications which did not in any way affect its essential points, and thus became the starting point of the series of reciprocated antagonisms which finally resulted at no distant date in the rupture of peace between England and France. Towards the end of 1802, some deputies of various Swiss cantons arrived in Paris on the summons of the first consul to discuss their respective interests before him and to bring out a reconciliation of the different factions, which for 5 years past had divided the Helvetic Confederation. Several attempts in this direction had been made by Napoleon since his accession to power. He had imposed the recognition of the independence of this republic at Lunéville. But the revolutions caused by the struggle of the various parties for power, the appeals to arms, and the intervention of European cabinets called for by the aristocracy had kept this unhappy country in a series of internecine wars and in a state of anarchy which it behooved the French government to terminate. The withdrawal of the French troops, which had been effected in accordance with the wishes of the Helvetic government, had only given a freer field to the passions of the adversaries. Before taking this decision, the object of which was to ascertain what use Switzerland would make of her restored independence, it had been proposed to vest the supreme authority in this country in a hereditary chief or a landman. Negotiations to this effect were commenced with the Margrave of Baden. Baron d'Alberg, at the time minister of this little state, who afterwards became Duke d'Alberg, and a naturalized Frenchman, was intermediary in these negotiations, which were carried so far, indeed, that the court of Baden thought to indemnify the minister for his trouble, who at that time directed foreign affairs in France. The troubles which broke out after the withdrawal of the French troops contributed to the failure of this arrangement. The Federalist faction, led by Alois Redding, was triumphing when the vanquished party decided to appeal to the French government and to demand its interference. The First Consul had several conferences, one of which lasted more than 6 hours with 10 deputies selected amongst the Federalists and the Unitaires. He listened to the arguments of the rival factions with attention and discussed them with the greatest impartiality. He spoke to them like a Swiss citizen, and at the head of two such great countries as France and Italy, gave them wise advice, and constantly manifested a moderation and a logic which convinced the Swiss deputies. He commissioned 4 French senators, Messieurs Barthélemy, Roederer, Fouché, and Desmoulins, to come to an understanding with the Swiss deputies and to draw up the draft of an act of conciliation, the basis of which should be entire equality between all the cantons, a voluntary renunciation of their privileges by the aristocracy, the division of the national debt into just proportions, and the federative organization of the 18 cantons by which their religious creeds, their habits, their languages, and their interests should be conciliated. This wise and disinterested policy calmed all spirit of faction, and thanks to our mediation, Switzerland was promptly pacified. These various parties agreed to it, and Alois Redding himself, who had declared himself one of the most ardent champions of the oligarchy, was present at the first diet and admitted the benefit due to the intervention of the powerful peacemaker. All the cantons expressed their gratitude to the First Consul in numerous addresses. The auditors were instituted by a decree of April 9, 1803. At first, they were only 16 in number and were charged with the functions of reporters to the various sections of the Council of State. They were, for the most part, young men of talent who had received a good education and who belonged, for the most part, to old families. Almost all of the reporters of this first nominations attained high positions in the state. Their number was later on considerably increased, experience having proved the advantages of this institution. The auditors, it may be said, formed a kind of nursery garden of administrators, trained in the school of the empire, and intended, when once familiar with the direction of affairs, to occupy the highest posts in the government. With this purpose in view, they were distributed over the various ministries, occupied in the prefectures and the sub-prefectures, in the offices of the public prosecutors, at the various courts, and in the financial administrations. They were later on commissioned to carry the portfolio containing the results of the labors of the ministers during the preceding week to the emperor, either to headquarters or during his journeys in the interior of France. In time of war, the auditors remained at the disposal of the Secretary of State, but most often were employed by the general intendant of the army, who used them on extraordinary missions. The majority of them were employed at the headquarters of those who superintended the conquered countries. In reward for services rendered in the course of these missions, they often received on their return to France advancement, which had not always been won by long experience. Nevertheless, and with very few exceptions, they justified the emperor's confidence. No complaint was ever made against their management of affairs, especially with regard to their honesty and loyalty. Almost all the families who had formerly had representatives in the departments of justice, of finance, and in the management of the principal affairs of state were drawn upon for auditors who rendered useful services. Napoleon often congratulated himself on the advantages which he had derived from this institution. I think it necessary to speak of a proposal which was made in the month of February 1803 by the King of Prussia to the chief of the House of Bourbon, at the time in retirement at Warsaw, that he should renounce his rights to the French crown in exchange for territorial and pecuniary advantages. The friendly relations which existed between the First Consul and the Prussian monarch. The answer made by Napoleon to the Comte de Lille on the 20th Fructidor, year 8, 7th September 1800, and the terms of the instructions given by the king to the president of the Regency of Warsaw have led to the belief that this proposal was inspired by the head of the French government. These instructions to the King of Prussia, to Monsieur Mayer, are known by the copy which Louis XVIII made of them in his own writing, and which was witnessed by the Archbishop of Reims, Monsieur de Talleyrand's uncle, and by Abbé Edgeworth. If such an insinuation was made to the King of Prussia, I never heard of it. Whatever interest Napoleon might have taken in the misfortunes of the fallen house, he did not think that the initiative ought to come from him. It was more than probable that the first idea of such a proposal was mooted in Prussia, because it was felt that the prolonged stay of the pretender in the Prussian states might one day lead to difficulties, and that the feelings of the first consul with regard to the Bourbons were known. Napoleon did not oppose the making of this proposal by the King of Prussia, but declared that he would in no way participate in it. The future emperor was so particularly interested in this proposal that one had very good reasons to think that he was not foreign to it. Napoleon was, however, very circumspect and much too shrewd not to understand that it required only a very little common sense to see that to ask the Bourbons to relinquish their rights was a practical acknowledgement that rights conferred by the vote of the nation had to be conferred by the sanction of the family which had reigned before him. It is natural to think that Louis XVIII thought it useful to his interest to attribute this proposal to his adversary, to draw attention to it as an indirect acknowledgement of his rights, and to take advantage of this opportunity to bring himself once more before the eyes of Europe by means of a declaration which came so exactly at the right time, and which there have been people found to style heroic. Without being unjust to this prince, it may be said that he was lacking in all the qualities which make a hero. Heroism, above all, implies the idea of danger, whilst Louis XVIII ran no risk whatsoever. He was a shrewd and crafty man, very selfish, and penetrated with an instinctive sentiment of his legitimacy, which always prevented him from despairing of his cause. His only arms were intrigues, so carefully planned that their source could never be attributed to him, and certain proclamations in which he also sought after literary renown. And as to these crooked maneuvers and the proclamations which he hurled forth from the depths of his retreat at times when it was impossible for him to be silent, it may be said that the former were not worthy of his cause, and that the latter, on the other hand, were more in accordance with the duties which his position laid upon him. I am not in a position to contest the authenticity of the documents published by the Restoration. I will not base any such denial on the instance when the government of the Restoration published a letter written by the emperor to King Joachim Murat, having previously altered it. M. de Blacas, having found the draft of this letter in the archives of the emperor's cabinet, deemed it right to publish it in the Moniteur, after having arranged it to suit the object which he desired to obtain by its publication. During the 100 days, I saw the copy of this letter written by the hand of Abbé Fleuriot, one of M. de Blacas' secretaries, with the alterations noted on the margin in red ink, but without seeking to base any denial on the want of good faith, which certain governments do not hesitate to employ when it is in their interest to do so. It is simpler to say that these negotiations with the Bourbons, having been transacted between them and the agents of Prussia without Napoleon's expression of any desire to be informed as to their progress, the zeal of these agents and the doctrines of the Berlin ministry gave the form that suited them to their proposals. This is Napoleon's own remark on the subject. I have omitted to say how the pretender happened to be at Warsaw. When the Emperor Paul I had reconciled himself to the consular government toward the end of 1800, his attitude towards the Comte de Lille, to whom 2 years previously he had shown hospitality at Mitau, suddenly changed. He ordered him to leave the Russian territory, although it was then the middle of a very severe winter. In his distress, the Comte de Lille asked shelter of the King of Prussia, who allowed him to establish himself at Warsaw. The King of Prussia, however, not wishing to displease the French government, notified the matter to the first consul, who did not make the least objection to the pretender's presence in a city in the Prussian states and tolerated it with good grace. In support of my statement that King Louis XVIII was not a man of heroic character, I may mention the following fact. When in the month of April 1796, the Comte de Lille left Verona at the request of the Venetian government, he asked, with the pride and dignity which befitted his rank, that his name should be erased from the Golden Book, and that the armor of Henry IV should be restored to him. But fearing to be given up by the Venetians or to fall in with the French troops on his way, he got the Duke de la Vagayen to drive in his carriage and to pretend to be the king, whilst he, disguising himself in humble attire, made good his escape out of the district occupied by the French troops. This fact is mentioned in a report from the Podesta of Verona to the Senate of Venice. The report in question was amongst the archives which were carried away to France after the French conquest of Venice. The instinctive sentiment of his legitimacy never left this prince. Monsieur Vignau, who in 1814 received a portfolio of the Ministry of the Interior at the hands of the provisional government, was commissioned in this capacity to establish Louis XVIII in the apartments of the Tuileries Palace on his return from England. The minister has since told me that the king walked through the various rooms with an air of the most profound indifference, without paying the least attention to Monsieur Vignau's explanation of the use to which each of the rooms was to be put. After reaching the room which used to serve as Napoleon's study, in which had been placed the writing table on which the prince used to write at Hartwell, Louis XVIII refused to go any further. He ordered an armchair to be brought up and sat down to his writing table as quietly as if he had only left the palace an hour previously to take a walk. Louisiana, which had formerly belonged to France, had been ceded to Spain in virtue of a secret clause in the Treaty of 1763, to the great discontentment of the inhabitants and also to the regret of the Versailles cabinet, which for a long time continued to be in communication with this country, but finally forgot it. England had never ceased to covet this province, which adjoined her American possessions, our maritime and commercial cities. In the interest of our shipping to the Antilles, hoped that an opportunity of regaining this colony might present itself. The first consul, having been made acquainted with this wish and with the future in view, began negotiations with the court of Madrid, tending to its retrocession. By a treaty between France and Spain, toward the end of 1800, we were once more put in possession of Louisiana. When the rupture of the Peace of Amiens became imminent, Napoleon considered, and rightly so, that our naval forces would not be able to protect all our colonies against a superior English fleet, and that the conquest of Louisiana especially would be matter of little difficulty to England. Foreseeing even that the first operation of the campaign would be an attack on this colony, he wished to put it beyond England's reach, and at the same time to destroy all England's hope of ever gaining possession of it by ceding it in its integrity to the United States. In consequence, he caused proposals to be made to the Americans to the effect that Louisiana should be handed over to them in return for a money indemnity. These funds, he considered, would help to pay the cost of the war, which he was about to wage with England.